It can be a real tricky thing to build a sculpture and maintain symmetry while doing so. The best way I've found is to number one, pay attention to it, of course. If you know it's a problem that has to be solved somehow, it makes it much easier to solve it. A lot of symmetry can be visually inspected easily. Left to right, up and down can be objectively observed, of course, and measured, and we've done that. This makes dealing with those a bit easier, I find. Currently in the video, those have been dealt with to a decent degree at least. I feel good enough at this time about all the basic proportions that we've established. But there are proportions in between all of these proportions. Volume, which has to be more or less symmetrically added as well, so that the nose or whatever feature you're working on doesn't appear to be extremely crooked. Since volume can't easily be inspected objectively, it's more felt, I would say, at least in most scenarios. It's therefore best to try and add the same to both sides and do it at the same time. So working both sides at the same time helps maintaining symmetry much more easily or manageable. It's already hard enough, but if you add something to one side, instantly move to the other side and do the same thing there. Of course, this only applies when working from the front view, and not so much when working from the side views, as symmetry is always a concern, but a concern that can only be properly handled from the front view. Some stuff ended up getting cut in the interest of time. I'm spending a few minutes here and there adjusting everything surrounding the nose and trying to make the piece come across as well presented. While I do think that this has little to do with actually sculpting the nose, it is going to be important to me. Making bad sculptures, even if it's for a demo purpose, is something that I find hard to do, and I find it hard to make good sculptures without putting quite a bit of effort into it. Especially when the changes needed to be made to make the thing look better are well within reason and easy to accomplish as well. We're not having to make sweeping changes here, I'm just adding some clay here and there and raking some parts down. So if you see some things that appear like big changes or even small changes happening around the nose and you didn't see me sculpt them and are wondering why, the reason is time. Some things had to be cut to make sure that the video didn't end up being 2 hours long. So we're beginning the finishing properly here. For me, finishing a sculpture can either happen in conjunction with the modeling, but it doesn't always happen that way, and sometimes it ends up like you're seeing here, where it's a separate step sort of. Especially, this is the case if I want a higher degree of finish to my work, essentially meaning that I want the work to be pretty smooth. When this is the case, I tend to treat the finishing of the surface as a step onto itself. I find either way is good, and it depends more on your inclination perhaps than anything else. Though sometimes the process of making the pieces forces me into this place where the finish ends up as its own thing. For me, this finishing step starts out with raking the surface of the sculpture using a rake with very low profile teeth. The low profile teeth are important because they keep the texture low relief and doesn't create tall hills and deep valleys. Low profile teeth can be achieved on your rake by either sanding the teeth down, or sometimes you can buy a rake with low profile teeth. Holes in the surface gets filled, so I'm not raking through a volume to achieve the effect of a surface that's been brought together. If you do this, you'll flatten out your sculpture, which is far from ideal and something we don't want to do. Raking will sometimes expose a lack of volume. When the surface is a bit more even, we can sometimes see a bit more. And when this occurs, I will begin to add volume back using a wooden tool and adding clay, of course. This is pretty common and something you should look out for and be prepared for. Pay close attention to how the surface begins to appear as it becomes cleaner and cleaner. Make sure you step back and take a good look at it. A lot of times your sculpture won't be able to hold up to the increase in resolution, and it will start looking flat and boring as you clean it up. It's important that we don't allow for that, and so stepping back lets us properly judge the values that are traveling across the surface of our work. And if the work appears flat and boring, then you need to look for places to add more volume. It's a common mistake to take a sculpture towards the finish line from a point where it's not ready for it. Essentially meaning that the jump between in-progress sculpture and finished sculpture gets to be too great. This causes major issues as we can't easily judge an in-progress sculpture, and so if we don't pay attention and push it towards finish, we can get some rather nasty surprises. Stepping back and making sure we never go on autopilot while finishing the work will help guard you against this issue in most scenarios. And even though I've been down this path many times before, you can see me stopping and adding volume here and there as I go. It's something we simply have to do, and we get better and better at anticipating how much volume we will eventually need. And even though that's the case, even though we do get better at anticipating, I still find that it's never perfect and I still need to add a bit more in a few places. If you're aiming for a clean surface, then you need to make sure that your tools are clean when you work. If you want to draw a sharp line, you have to sharpen your pencils, essentially. I'm constantly cleaning my tools in my hands or between my fingers here. Some students or colleagues of mine like to have a damp cloth on their stand and use that to get their tools clean. Whatever method you use, you need to clean your tools constantly when trying to achieve a clean surface. Dry clay on your tools, which will build up almost no matter what you're doing, is going to scratch the surface as you go, and the only way to avoid this is to clean your tool. Perhaps if you're after some texture in your work, then you can use the dry clay on your tool to your advantage and create some rather random patterns. But here I'm after a smooth result, so I'll do the work while cleaning my tools a lot. The final cleanup is done using a smooth loop tool, and here I prefer a wire loop because the round wire has a tougher time denting the work as you softly graze it across the surface. A similar tool with a flat wire, often called a ribbon tool, will more easily dent the surface and essentially just create more work for you to do. If the clay is firm enough, and at this point it should be close to leather tough, this process should be easy enough. If the clay is too soft, this process is a bit of a mess and very tough to pull off, frankly. So let the clay sit for a bit to make sure it's suitable for this kind of work. As a final touch, if the clay is firm enough, you can use your fingers even to smooth it out slightly. The clay really has to be pretty tough for this to work, so you don't get any fingerprints. But if your clay is fairly dry, this trick, using your fingers and lightly scrubbing across the surface, works really well. So after many hours of work, we've reached the final state of this little nose piece. Anything you aim to do well is going to take time in sculpture. It's a thought, or a reality rather, that we simply have to accept and come to terms with, I think. Even something seemingly so simple, something like a nose, something we encounter every day in the mirror, is infinitely complex.